Alright, I'm going to try to record this all in one go, 15 minutes, no editing. This, I guess, is what we're going to call the Git Gud Rant, which hopefully will be more informative than ranty. I'm going to put a couple of links at the bottom of this for some stuff that I'm going to need people to read so they can get some context here. Basically, I'm just trying to give people a very quick rundown, a basic gestalt, if you will, about how to play the meta of the game, the meta being treating the game as a game. Now, right now, the big thing, of course, is doing raids, but technically you can take what I'm about to tell you and extrapolate it into both attacking and defending gyms. Also, I apologize if the camera angle is weird and whatnot. I'm not wearing a jacket, so I've got the GoPro on my belt, which is no doubt going to give some people motion sickness because of my natural hip sway. Anyway, the main thing you need to know about doing raids right now is that the raid boss only has one attack, but it's the best attack he has, the timer. Alright? You can literally throw as many bodies at him as you want, and if you had infinite time, you could always beat a raid boss, no sweat. But if you don't beat him within the time, you lose. Which means that you have to prioritize offense. You need guys with really strong attack power who have as much super effectiveness as you can possibly eke out. Like, you can fall back on stuff as a little bit less than ideal if need be, but the more people you have who know what they're doing, are throwing high attack, super effective stuff at it, the better off you're going to be. The fewer people you're going to need, the less resources ultimately you're going to spend picking everybody up off the floor afterwards. Now, that doesn't mean that defense has no role, but the defense has to play into your offense. The point of defense has to be keeping a high DPS Pokemon in the fight as long as possible to deal as much damage as possible. Alright? Now, with that said, Pokemon Go is a very simple game. It doesn't have very many moving parts. Basically, the only three things you really need to know about is stats, typing, and movesets. Now, stats are very simple. Every Pokemon has three stats. Stamina, which is what your trainer, your team leader refers to as HP. It actually just means stamina, but stamina just means hit points anyway. Then you've got attack and defense. Now, your Pokemon's combat power, CP, is determined by these things, and Niantic understands the meta. Attack has a bigger effect on your CP than stamina does, which has a higher effect than what defense does. Which is why a Pokemon with a really high defense and stamina still has lower CP than one that has a really high attack half the time. Blissey, for example, is kind of one of the exceptions. The reason Blissey's CP is so high is because his stamina is insane, and his defense is really good. But his attack power sucks, but the other stats are just so high, it looks like he has a high combat power. But you pretty much never want to bring Blissey into a raid because he doesn't do enough damage. He might stay in the fight for a long time, but for as long as he's in the fight, he's not putting out a lot of damage. There's some other See, the thing is, when you go into a raid, the game recommends a bunch of Pokemon for you, but it chooses by prioritizing defense. And you don't need that. You need to prioritize offense. Right? So, it is kind of useful that the game recommends you stuff based on defense, because until you fight a raid boss, you don't know what moveset it has. And certain movesets are harder to take on than others. Well, we'll get into this by the end of the rant, I'm sure. But anyway, you can use the recommendations to figure out what attacks it has, but you've got to change your team up as best as you can to have stuff that does as much damage as possible. As a secondary, you do want some defense. Now, one of those links basically has a list of Pokemon and their base stats, which is what you're going to want to base all this off of. What you're really looking for is stuff that has 200 or more attack power. And if it has less than 200 attack power, it's got to be using super effective attacks, and it has to have other really good stats to back it up. Lapras, for example. Like, Lapras was really good against Rayquaza, however you pronounce it, but only because Rayquaza had a double weakness. We'll get to that later. Like, if not for that, Lapras is really, really weak. He just doesn't have enough attack power. Then you've got Pokemon who are like Absol, who have really high attack power, but his defense and stamina are rock bottom. So he's what we refer to as a glass cannon. Jinx is kind of in the same boat. So glass cannons are good, but you could get better half the time. Still, I like to lead off with a glass cannon just to try to do as much damage as quickly as possible when the guy's charge attacks are a little more predictable. In general, stuff that has a CP of about 2400 or more are generally useful. The higher CP, the better, but you have to really look under the hood to make sure you're using something that is putting out as much damage as possible. Aggron is another example of something that gets recommended a lot because of its really high defense and great resistances, but he's not super effective against a lot of stuff, and his attack power is just slightly below 200. He has his uses, but not a lot of them right now. All right. Second thing, typing. Typing was what determines what a Pokemon is weak to and what it is strong against. It also has a slight effect on the moveset with something called the same type attack bonus, or stab. Essentially, it just means that when a Pokemon uses an attack that is of the same type as itself, it does an extra 25 damage. So essentially that means that, for example, when Tyranitar uses Stone Edge, it says it has an attack power of 100, it actually has an attack power of 125. Right? So in general, you want to use Stab. But if you don't get Stab, you're going to want to be using an off-type attack that's super effective. Example, Ursaring with fighting-type moves, still pretty effective against stuff that's weak towards fighting. He has the attack power to back it up. He doesn't get Stab, but that's just an example of like working within the meta. Oh, I can't get a really good fighting type, but I can get an Ursaring, and Ursaring can get fighting moves. See how it works? Because fighting moves are good against a lot of stuff. They're also weak against a lot of stuff. But since you're the attacker, you get to choose who you're using to attack the raid boss, and the raid boss doesn't get a choice. He just has to sit there and take it. So the game highly prioritizes offense right now. So you're pretty much just going to have to play along. A couple of things. We'll use Aggron as a good example. In general, Pokemon are either weak to something, immune to it, or they're strong against it offensively. So Aggron, for example, has a steel typing, which has a lot of defensive good properties, but he does have 3 weaknesses. Rock has a lot of weaknesses, but offensively it's better. It's super effective against more things and a wider variety of them. They also stack in a strange way. In the original game, there was immunities, but because of the way combat in Pokemon Go works, they can't really allow immunities, because then you could like beat up a Mewtwo with nothing but psychic attacks with a flock of Murkrows, because they'd be straight immune. So instead, immunity is treated as double resistance. And the numbers aren't quite perfectly even, but they more or less, for our purposes, are resistances and weaknesses more or less cancel each other out, while immunities and weaknesses result in essentially just a resistance, because immunity is treated as double resistance, more or less. And if you have both a resistance and an immunity, you essentially have triple resistance, and that will make your Pokemon much harder to damage with that kind of attack. For example, Flygon right now is one of the best anti-electric things in the game because he is both immune as a ground type and resistant as a dragon type, and he gets a full ground moveset, which is super effective against ground types. Going back to Aggron, for example, he is both resistant to grass as a steel type, but weak towards it as a rock type, so it more or less evens out. He is, however, double weak towards both fighting and ground. Steel is not resistant to water. Rock is weak towards it, so he just ends up being weak. End result being, if you run into an Aggron, you want to throw fighting types at him, then you want to throw ground types at him, and then you want to hose him down with the water types, in roughly that order. Alright, last but certainly not least, movesets. Now, Pokemon's moves actually have a pretty big impact on how effective they are. There's the stab we were already talking about, and of course, super effectiveness. Whenever you see a Pokemon that is weak towards something, you know that means that another Pokemon is therefore strong against it, at least offensively. There are some weird things like dragons and ghost types, for example, are both super effective against themselves. So a dragon type sent against another dragon type will be really great unless the other dragon type also has dragon moves. For example, we have a Latios right now who is a dragon psychic type, and when he has Zen Headbutt and Solar Beam, a Dragonite is really effective against him. But when he has Dragon Breath and Dragon Claw, not so much. Your Dragonite will do a lot of damage while he's in there, but he won't be in there for long. In addition to super effectiveness, or resistance for that matter, you also have to worry about the damage per second and energy per second that an attack makes, and just how fast it is. Good example, if your Jolteon has Thunder Shock, he'll do a little bit less damage per second, and I believe have a little bit less energy buildup per second than if he had Volt Switch. The problem with Volt Switch is it's really, really slow. Like, you use it, and for 2.5 seconds, you are effectively locked down. You can't do anything. Thunder Shock, meanwhile, is a lot of really weak hits in rapid succession. And that means that you, after you use one, if you see the boss using a charge attack, you can effectively dodge out of the way. When it comes to your charge moves, the ones that you actually build up energy to use, generally having more bars is better. Like 100 energy attacks, the stuff that uses a full energy bar, like Hydro Pump, generally tends to have really great damage per second, but not very much damage per energy. It's also less reliable. You can't like get one off right before you get knocked out, because you need to build up 100 power for it. You also tend to overkill things, because if it has like 50 hit points left and you get an attack that does 140 damage, well, you're wasting all that damage. So in general, you want attacks that have a good ratio between damage per energy and damage per second, and that use, how should I put this? And that have the profile of the kind of Pokemon that you want. Like if you are a Jolteon, I highly recommend giving him Thundershock and Thunderbolt, because Thunderbolt has 2 bars, pretty much the best balance between damage per second, damage per energy. It's relatively fast, and since he's so fragile, you need to be dodging with him. Meanwhile, something like Ampharos, he can get away with having Zap Cannon and Volt Switch to a certain degree, because he has enough bulk he can actually take one on the chin every so often. So that's pretty much the gist of what I'm getting at here when it comes to, let me just give you the TLDR, TLDW, too long didn't watch. Prioritize damage. Get just enough resistance to keep your guys doing damage on the field. That's pretty much what it comes down to. You want to do as much damage as possible while giving just enough thought to defense that you can keep your guys alive long enough that they can continue doing damage. I don't think I did too bad there for this being completely unscripted. About 16 minutes, a little longer than I want to do. Oh well, I'm going to give probably more in-depth looks into this sort of thing later, especially when it comes to typing, because that's probably the most complicated part of this whole game. Signing off, catch you later.